This is the S402. This particular unit is the lightest prototype that I had made before the final production run. This unit is unpainted. All the final units that will be purchased on SalvoStudiosltd.com will be painted with a powder-coated, a fine texture black. And this prototype in particular I thought would be good for a video because you can see a lot of the fasteners on video better than you could if it was the black unit. The only difference is a couple adjustments to some locations for things, very minor. One of those is the rear I/O for the main board is a little bit off, so I won't be installing the rear main I/O for this build. But the goal of this video is to walk through some basics of the S402, hopefully have some fun along the way, and then do a build to show exactly what it takes to build inside the S402. First off with the specs, the dimensions of the S402 are 14.5, which would be in this direction, by 12.875 inches in this direction, and then 3 inches from the camera's perspective from the rear up. That brings it to about 9.5 liters, just under 9.5 liters in volume. What you see here is everything that will come with the base unit. Also, I have to say, subject to change, but this is everything that I've purchased for enough units to sell, so there'd be no reason not to unless there was a compatibility issue discovered late in the process. What you see is the main chassis with the motherboard mounts, power supply mounts, GPU mounts. There is an accessory box. We'll get to that in a second. It'll have a front panel dual type A interface for USB, 20-pin motherboard interface for connection on the other side. There's going to be a power supply extension cable included in every one. This is actually a Mac Pro power cable that's been cut because it has nice flexibility. You can bend it quite far to get it to fit in, and because the cable is so flexible, it makes a really great extension cable inside a small form factor unit. Keeps the distance between the top edge and the power supply short. The PCIe extension cable, this will be a good representation. This is the exact one of the production extension cables that will be included. There's a rear reset button and a front power button. The front power button, there'll be an option to upgrade to a shallower version. This version sticks out quite far from the front panel. The shallower version will provide more support for SFX-L units in particular, and you'll see why during this build, because I'm going to use my Leon Lee SFX-L unit, and you'll see where the interference would be. There will be 3 fans included. There's 3 mounting locations for either 60 or 70 millimeter fans, one on the bottom from your perspective, and then 2 on the top. These 2 on the top and the one on the bottom, all 3 actually, support up to 25 millimeter depth fans, so you can do a 70 by 25 or a 60 by 25 in all 3 locations. But these 3 fans will be included with every S402 purchase. They are PWM fans, and they won't be mounted by default, but they do come with it. Then there's going to be the power supply bracket, mounting bracket, which will support 2 2.5-inch drives underneath. The restriction on these 2 drives underneath the power supply unit is that they have to be slim drives, so 7 millimeters. Actually less than 9 is what I'm saying, but there's not really anything but 9 or 7. So 7 millimeter 2.5-inch drives will fit underneath the power supply unit nicely, and then power supply unit supported will be SFX or SFX-L with the purchase of the upgraded front panel button that's shallower to avoid any clearance issues with that. Then there's going to be the hard drive mount, and this hard drive mount supports 3 2.5-inch drives or 2 3.5-inch drives. I'm not going to really cover this much. I'm going to make a separate video about the options for this and the correct way to install it, because it is going to be a little bit confusing when you're not looking at the install guide that I made as to where the discs actually need to be installed. And finally, there are a couple mounting plates that cover the rear of the chassis. This one covers the rear of the main board. And then there's a vented panel. I'll show you where this one goes towards the end. And then there's a vented panel over here to my left. It covers this side. And it's a very thick panel. It's thick and it's great. I weighed about 200 pounds and I stood on this unit right in the middle, and no give, no nothing. So it's going to be perfectly acceptable to take some abuse. It's quite thick. I think it's 14 gauge galvanized steel. So it won't have a problem absorbing some abuse, although hopefully you won't experience any abuse with your case. Inside the accessory box, there's going to be labeled screws for various things that you need to install. There's going to be some horizontal epoxy 1-inch round feet, self-adhesive. So if you actually leave the S402 in this current orientation when you want to just put it on your desk or whatever, these feet come in handy to put on the bottom to keep it from scratching anything. I do have other things available, like mats that can go underneath in both the horizontal or the vertical position to protect your surface underneath it. So if you're interested in those, you can check out my website. There's a handle. Doesn't look like much, not super special, but the handle does, it is sturdy enough to be able to carry it, trust me. And it fastens with 2 thumb screws that'll come with it. Then there are 2 sets of feet for a vertical orientation. These are actually painted units from a previous build, but they're identical in design to what the final product will be. And then finally, there's a GPU bracket, which I'll cover when we go through the build. But basically, this bracket will allow the GPU to be installed in this direction, and then this bracket will go with the GPU into the rear and then fasten to the rear of the chassis. That simplifies production for the main chassis itself and reduces costs. So that's out of the way. Now we'll talk about what I'm going to build. I'm going to build a ITX ASRock B450 board here, and I've got an 1800X Ryzen R7. I've got this 92 millimeter adapter with a Noctua 25 millimeter deep PWM fan. It's a Chromax fan. The adapter I got from JHack. You can check him out as J-Hack, and he makes adapters for the Cryorig C7, both in 120 and 92 millimeters, and I've had both, and they both work great. He also makes cases, by the way. You should check those out. But these two, I've got some Trident Z Neo 16 gig sticks in here to give 32 gig of RAM. And on the other side, I've got a 1 terabyte Silicon Power NVMe 1 terabyte, though I said 1 terabyte, but it's a 1 terabyte model. So that's going to be, when I actually use it, that's what I'm going to do. I have some 2.5-inch drives I'm going to install in this chassis, but I will not be using those in the actual system when it's done. This power supply is an SFX-L Leon Lee. It is the best case scenario for the front panel button because this is the orientation it will be installed. And as you can see, the rear interface for the modular connectors for the power supply unit are shifted to the left, which is important because if it's installed in this direction, you see you've got a wide gap here between the edge and the first connector. That gives the most clearance for this front panel button, but this front panel button will still come in contact and interfere with this interface slightly on this model, which is why I encourage anybody using an SFX-L to upgrade to the shallower front panel button, which will reduce this clearance down to where it shouldn't interfere with any SFX-L units. But you'll see that when I get to it. I'm also going to install an EVGA GeForce 1050 or 1650, excuse me, 1650 video card. And the reason I chose this one and why it still has the plastic on it is because I wanted to get a three slot GPU to test fit to make sure that there's clearance around the 3-slot GPUs and that it works well. And so this will be the one that I'm going to build with now to just show the 3-slot support. As I said, because the drive mount I'll be doing a separate video on, I'll probably have a two-slot GPU for that to show how drives can be installed underneath the GPU if you use a 2-slot GPU. So with that said, let's get started. All right, I'm going to start with the power supply bracket. And the first thing that you got to do is install some 2.5-inch drives on this. And the two that I have are slim drives. This being the orientation that the bracket actually mounts in, is going to be important to note because the direction that you install the 2.5-inch drives is also important. Since this bracket installs just like so, the gap between this bracket and the base of the chassis is just under 9 millimeters. So that's why you need to go with a 7 millimeter 2.5-inch drive, like one of these two here. Most consumer 2.5-inch SSDs come in 7 mils anyway in that form factor. So this shouldn't be that big of a deal. And so they mount to the left, so the interfaces be to the left. If you turn it around and mount it to the right, what you'll find is there's not a whole lot of room to install your interface, although it could possibly be done if you wanted to run your cables around or around to the bottom or around to the top. But the idea was you get some 90-degree adapters, angle those adapters just outside and up from the SATA drives, and then you have a short hop over to the main board to keep the clutter down as far as wiring is concerned. These drives, I will ship for these drives 8 mounting screws for 2.5-inch drives, and that's going to be screw pack number 2. I'm only going to use 4 of these now, 2 per drive, because I don't feel like I want to bore you. And I can't, although with the magic of editing, I could probably speed it up. We'll see what I do. But for now, I'm just going to screw it in, 2 screws. And these have to be done first because the power supply is going to cover these access holes. So when you think about installing 2.5-inch drives, your options are whether or not you want to put them under this power supply bracket, or if you want to put them on the main drive mounting bracket that'll sit right here on top of these vents. If you wanted to install them on top of those vents, you'll have easier access in the long haul, because then you would only have to remove the GPU, which is actually quite easy once you get it installed. But if you install disks here, which is also fair, you just would have to uninstall the power supply in order to get back to it, which means taking all the cables off, taking the bracket off. And so this is a bit more of a long-term install, like you don't want to be fiddling around with it, right? And so now it's going to mount like this. So with this in place, you can see where the interfaces are, and these are tie downs, cable tie downs for zip ties. So now all we have to do is install the power supply. Sorry for my chair squeaking. They're going to be the bag label number 4. These are standard PC screws. They're going to be, the standard is actually 632. So you'll need 2 of these. And just screw it in like so, making sure that the fan access is facing up, so that when you have the vented cover on, the power supply actually has a place to intake the air, the cool air. And once that's on, then it just slips right into place, just like so. Now, there are 5 mounting screws for this bracket into the main chassis. There are 2 on the bottom, and there's going to be 3 on the top. The reason there are 3 on the top, I'm only going to suggest that users screw 2 in is because one of these is going to be covered by the power supply extension cable where it goes into the power supply. So you really only need to plug 2 of those in, but plug the power supply extension cable in, and then you get the cable, and because it's flexible, you got to kind of figure out what's going to work best for you in terms of the cable orientation. This particular unit hasn't been deburred, the prototype, so these vents up here are actually a bit rough on the cable because they can kind of even cut it a little bit, but the final units will be painted after deburring, so that won't be a problem. And like I said, once it's in place, you're going to install in 4 of those 5 locations, which will be bag number 3, which are wafer head 632 screws. And so I like to just get one in here so I can rotate it around. I advise not to tighten any of the screws until you have everything in place like you want it. It just makes it easier to move things around into the orientation or the holes that you need to get the screws into. Also, one of the little tricks that I learned as a result of just doing this for a long time is very helpful if when you get a screw in, you back it out until you hear it click, and then you can go forward because you know that the threads are lined. So you see I'm installing only 2 screws in the top because the third hole, the one up here, has been blocked by the power supply interface for the extension cable. I'm going to go ahead and tighten these up because I've got most of my screws in place. Turn this back around so I can see and you can follow. And now the power supply has effectively been installed and mounted. We will have to probably play around with some of these cables and how we want to route them to make it pretty before it's done. But for now, this is how I'm going to leave it. And next up is going to be the main board. We're just going to work ourselves in a counterclockwise motion through the chassis as far as installing things is concerned. I'm also going to add a couple cables that are not included. These are just some fan splitters and a noise reducer. I find that the Noctua noise reducer little extension, the shorter extension to reduce the noise, works well with these 70mm fans because they can get kind of noisy. And so this just reduces the RPM and makes them much quieter. And they just go into a Y cable, and then I've got a standard extension here for the fan at the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and do these because I don't want to do it when the motherboard's in here. It's just going to be that much more awkward. Although I'm going to have a problem with this. There we go. That's my thought. Okay. So that one's in. And now this. A little bit of advice. I don't know if it works for everybody, but when you go to install these fans up at the top here, because like I said, they won't come pre-installed, but when you go to install them, if you put the cable on, like, because I'm routing right now, the cables are routing over the top and into this compartment. If you go ahead and put the cables in place for the first one's routing the cables up just underneath this tab, and then take the second one and get it oriented so that the cables, based on which 90-degree rotation it is, you may want the cables to have the same or close to the same length over here. If you go ahead and pin that up against this tab, this bend, as you install the second fan, it goes a lot easier than trying to squeeze those tiny little cables between the fan frame and the chassis here. So those are done. I'm gonna have to clean up this later because I don't want to stick my head in the way of the camera. But for now, I'll leave that kind of jammed so it doesn't get in the way. I'm gonna move the PCIe extension cable. The extension cable will be pre-installed, assuming that you're going to be using a 2-slot GPU. If you wanted to use a 3-slot GPU, there are just 2 screws, one in the rear and one in the one in the rear and one in the front, towards the front of the chassis. You unscrew them, you move it up to the second set of standoffs. That's for a 2-slot GPU, or a 1-slot GPU if you want to go all the way up to the top. If you had a bifurcation adapter installed on your ITX board, you could, in theory, go ahead and get a second extension cable here and install 2, and have a 2-slot GPU at the bottom and a 1-slot at the top, or a 2-slot here with the 1-slot underneath it. It's kind of up to you and what the chassis will allow you to do in terms of space. I can't cover all the possible combinations, but if you purchase the case, you'll be able to see most of those and what's possible for yourself. Or send me a message and ask me. I don't mind checking to see whether or not something should fit. Normally I'd put the IO shield, but remember, I'm not doing the IO shield install here. So with the main board, be sure that fan connector's not in the way. And then we'll be using these number 4 screws again, which are 632s. I try to do as much 632 as I can because it's a standard PC type screw, and it's fairly available. So it should make it a little bit easier if you lose a screw to replace it. I'm not going to worry so much with the cable management for right now, because most people are going to be dependent on their main board. Their mainboard manufacturer as to where the different things are located. Unless you've got an ASRock B450 fatality, this wouldn't really be useful to you. So I'll worry about the reset and power buttons later and come back to it. With the main board in place, I think I had this run up to there. So these fan connectors make sense to go ahead and install them while I've got access. Okay, so that's done. Motherboard's installed. That wasn't too bad, was it? I'm going to put this away because we don't need that. Now next up is the GPU. With the GPU, there's going to be 2 steps. First off is with the bracket. What you're basically going to do is you want to line up the bracket so that the holes for the threaded holes for the screws can be installed through the normal mounting points. But what's going to be different about this is normally with a bracket you would install it from the bracket through to hold it up against another piece, but this is backwards. It's backwards to make it easier again to manufacture. So screws number 5 those are special shortened screws, 632 again, but they're only an 1/8 inch long to keep clearances down. And essentially, you're going to install this loosely. Only thing you care about right now at this stage is getting them loosely installed so that you can align it better when you get it into the chassis for the rear I/O access. I'm having problems finding the threads on this. There we go. So I tightened that one a bit so I wouldn't keep pinching my thumb. It's hard to hold it without looking straight down and doing this. And if your GPU or your PCIe card, whatever you install here, if it is not 3 slots, you don't have to install all 3 of these screws. They're just provided to provide a little bit more support. So you see how it's loose and I can move it. That's going to provide me with a little bit of adjustment on the rear so that if I want to bring the card up or down based on where it aligns with the rear slots, I can. And next up, once that's on there, you angle it down and line it up with the slot on the rear, because this point has to fit through the rear of the chassis. You line it up with the slot on the rear, and then you look for the PCIe extension, making sure this white, I'm going to pull this out so you can see this white tab, that actually locks the GPU in place. So when it's all the way forward, you're not going to be able to get your card in or out. You got to slide it backward, or this little tab right here is going to not allow you to either pull it out or push it in. So you got to make sure this white tab is moved away from the rear of the chassis. So that comes in, and then once you align it with the PCIe extension bracket, should plug in. So there we go, and then you can pop the slider over to lock it in place basically, but there's still play here. So what we want to do, I'm going to face this straight on its face like that so you can see, is now we've got the option to loosen these a little bit more if we want and make adjustments up and down, but you're looking to install 2 screws into those holes now. And those will be the last number 4 standard PC screws. And I can't see, so I'm hoping that these are somewhat aligned. I have to tilt it so I can see what I'm doing. Come on, line up straight. See. There we go. Let's get this one in. There we go. Now, that's in, and you can see there's 3 slots. GPU looks good. There's still a little bit with these EVGA cards. They've got I don't know what I'd call it, a bead running along the rear I/O plate, and they're so close to the tab that I basically had to extend this just a little bit more for the production model to ensure that it clears that. But if it doesn't, it still is in there. It still installs fine. It doesn't cause any functional problems. And that's the GPU. So the GPU installed, that's actually the plastic board. It's not moving anywhere. Yeah, okay. With the GPU installed, I wanted to show real quick optional AIO install. There's enough space with this particular GPU, and any GPU up to 200 mils in length will allow 120 mil AIOs to be installed. A couple things with this chassis. The reason why you see the interference with the PSU block is this bottom fan will have to be removed if you're going to use 120 mil AIO, and that'll allow the whole thing to shift down to clear the power supply mounting bracket. So this is actually just an old Corsair AIO that I had, but it would mount here and it would exhaust through the vents to the other side. If you were to use this, you wouldn't be able to use the hard drive mounting bracket at the same time, because the AIO needs some place to exhaust, and that place is going to be those rear slots. So this would be the time that you would install the AIO after the GPU. You could do it before, but just having the clearance to get the GPU in, I think it's easier to do the GPU first. Okay, and with that, I'm going to pause here and I'm going to clean up the wires, and I'm going to get it ready to use these zip tie mounts built into the chassis to show you how you should be able to help with some wire management. All right, I wanted to stop. I got most of the way through adding the cables in, and I started thinking about how I was going to clean them up. And I realized that one of the things I should do is show with these zip tie mounts. These are going to be the zip ties that are actually included. I think there's going to be 4 per chassis. What you should think about is these things are not easy to reach, especially after the components are installed. You can see, or maybe you can't, this one down here. It's very difficult to get to, and it's going to be like threading a needle to get the thing through it and then lift it back up. So you're going to have to use some dexterity, or think ahead and have these guys already threaded through so that you can better access them once the main board and the power supply are installed. I got this one mostly through, but there's a slot in that fastener, that anchor is what I'm going to call it actually. And once you slide the zip tie through, then you're just going to zip tie it down to hold it in place. So think about when you've got power supply cables, ATX cables, the 12-volt CPU cable, the GPU cable, any SATA cables or accessory cables being run through the case, where you're going to have them, and just check and see if your zip ties are already there, or if just be aware, basically, so that you know, one, you have access, and 2, you're going to be able to get those zip ties threaded through that fastener and then zipped up to keep things nice and clean. But that's all I had as I was doing this. And next up, I should have it a little bit cleaned up for these stock cables. All right, so I've only used 3 zip ties here. I used one on this anchor, one up here on that anchor, and then I just bundled a lot of the cables together right there. The GPU is plugged in, the main board's plugged in, power supplies run over, the fans are all plugged in, and you know, I like to find where cables naturally like to go and then work with that if I can. You know, you might find yourself unplugging and replugging, like this fan here. I kind of want to unplug it and plug it back in again, just to see if I position this 12-volt CPU cable in a different way, if it'll look nicer. But for the sake of just having this built, it's done. Now, what you may notice is, although you might not be able to see it, this front panel button does interfere with the rear sensor of the of the power supply, this sensor connector here. And that's why the new buttons are actually only going to come out to about right there. So it's almost right up to the edge of the power supply unit itself. And since SFX has a standard width, even the L's, it's a standard width and standard height, it's the length that changes. It should prove to be much more compatible with all SFX-L units that I'm aware of. And if there are any exceptions, I'll try to post them to my website as a caveat for when someone's purchasing the S402. But I'm unaware right now of any SFX-L units that will be a problem once the new buttons arrive. And by the way, that's it terminates about where my thumbnail is here with the wires included. So it's not like it has this additional space for wires. It's the wires come out and the terminals for the wires end right here. So you could even wire or run it up and around if you wanted, or you could run it down this way. I think by default they're going to have fairly short connectors on them as part of the SFX-L support. But this is now, this has all been installed, and what I want to do is walk through the rest of the install process for the panels, the feet, and the handle. I'm going to start with the vented panel, which I've got some screws here, some special silver screws here for that vented panel, because this is an unpainted model prototype. The screws that will be shipping with these will be black. It's the exact same screw, but there'll be a black screw. And so you'll just screw these 4 in and flip it over to the other side. And then we'll install the motherboard cover panel. And that is the S402 installed, but for the handle, and the feet. So let's start with the feet. Actually, I'm going to flip it over. I like to orient it so that this fan is nearest the bottom to give those other two a better chance at cooling. What you'll notice, hopefully, is that there is a slot design, a key slot. So on the stand, if this is hopefully in focus, what you'll see on the top here is that there's a key that goes in the slot, and then the head goes through the bigger portion, and then you slide it. In this case, on this one, you slide it down, and then the hole will align. And I'll include with it a bag of thumb screws, 2 for the handle and 2 for one for each stand rather. And so this will go in. I'll just screw right there, and then this goes in, it slides. And you can use a screw to tighten these, a screwdriver rather, to tighten these 2 up. You can do it on the handle too, but it usually works pretty well just like that. And then on the top, you see there's the keys, but with the handle there is no male portion to slot into that and slide over. The reason these are actually keyed to begin with is so that the stands could be installed on either this side or the other side to have it in an inverted orientation. So this just goes on with the thumb screws. By the way, these holes on this particular handle, I took note for the fabricator. These holes are a little large, and I want them a little bit tighter, and so I made a note for them to to make these a little bit smaller to make it a better fit. There we go. And so now you have a handle. Holds it just fine. And one of the things I wanted to cover, so now that the build is complete, is some of the things that will come with the pre-order anyway, and I might include this on all the order, and that is the vertical stand. Which is this here. It's basically a mouse pad material, and it'll protect any surface underneath it from these feet digging into it, because these feet are actually they're thick steel and they're kind of pointy, and rather than pay to have the fabricators try to finish each one of these off to a bit more smooth, to make them a bit more smooth, or put rubber feet or come up with some kind of solution, I thought this was the best option. And I think I'm actually going to include that with every 402 purchase because it's just a nice touch. And then if you do run horizontally, there's a separate horizontal mat that will fit underneath it. But I got to take the handle and the feet off. And so if I do that, it's designed to be installed with the vented side up. So it would be sitting like this, and that would be how it would normally sit in a horizontal application. This is the horizontal mat, and so you can see it would sit. It's made out of the same material. I'm not going to remove this from the bag. So it would sit something like this, and then right on top of the surface, right, just like that. So that's pretty much it. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you have questions or comments, please let me know. Looking forward to being able to get the S402 sold, and I think that I'm pretty proud of it. So if you have questions, obviously you can post on YouTube, or you can send me an email at salvostudiosltd@gmail.com, or contact me through my website, salvostudiosltd.com, because Salvo Studios is apparently a Salvation Army affiliate or spin-off of some kind. So LTD, don't forget the LTD is the point. Again, hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions, let me know. Check out my other video I'm about to do for the different hard drive configurations as well as GPU and how that all will work out. Okay, thanks. One additional thing I wanted to note was somebody had asked about cable lengths, recommended cable lengths, and that's tricky because some motherboards have the ATX power supply connector here, some have it up here, some have the 12-volt CPU over here, some have it up there. The location on the main board is really the concern, plus the depth of the length of the SFX unit that's going to be installed also plays a role, right? If it's a standard SFX, it's probably going to be about right here, so that's several centimeters difference between the SFX-L units when it comes to length. But I thought I'd show, at least this is a custom set of Corsair SF600 cables that I had made for the 401 actually, but it works well with the 402. And this is the ATX 20+4 cable, and it is 30 centimeters in length. So on an SFX unit, you'd probably have it about right there. If you're connecting to this board, it would be something like that. You can see it's actually been bent like that because it's been installed in a system before. And then 37 centimeters is the CPU connector, which this end would go into the power supply, I think about right there. And then this end would be the CPU connector. So that's 37 centimeters. And then we've got the GPU. I made these for 12 centimeters, and the purpose was I was thinking these were going to be a little bit more flexible than they are. They're actually not quite flexible. They work great, and they look good, but they're not as flexible as I'd like them to be. So this is 12 centimeters, and the standard Corsair unit is probably, like I say, somewhere in here. So when you go to connect it, you know, there's a little bit of pressure. It wants to push against you when you compress it down like that. But 12 centimeters is actually a good length. If you go much shorter, you're gonna restrict yourself on, depending on where the power connector is for the GPU. If you've got a long GPU and it's way over here, you know, this whole area is potential for connection. So having a 12 centimeter cable in my case, no pun intended, in my scenario, was to have the most compatibility for any future device that I have. And then one of the things that I decided to do with mine was there's a lot of SATA Y adapters for Molex. Molex is just a lot more, there's just a lot more options for Molex connectors, whether it's fans or pumps, LEDs, what have you. The Molex connector rather than the SATA is just a little bit easier to use if you want to have it. So I got this stubby Corsair SF connector that goes from a 6-pin to 2 Molex connectors, short Molex connectors, and these are 12 centimeters as well. And the idea is I plug them into the you know, the SATA or accessory 6-pin interface on my Corsair PSU, and then if I want to run two SATA SSDs or hard drives, I can get a Molex to 2 SATA Y adapter and just adapt it off of this and hide the cables so that, you know, you see the nice silver, but when it gets to going from the Molex to the disk, it's hidden underneath either the PCIe extender or some of the other cables in here, and it's just lost to the eye. And then if you had a pump, if you were doing that kind of thing, or a set of LEDs, another Molex connector to power a separate thing is just a lot more flexible than having individual devices, at least in my experience. So I'd recommend looking up something like this just to keep your options open for anything you want to add, if it's fans or LEDs or discs or what have you. So that's all I wanted to add. Thanks.